British Empire, Adolf Hitler, how you looking at the British Empire? You start an invasion, you must be taking Britain for Poland, but you'd be a failure. Britain is supported by America.
Coming to a tropical island, so beautiful, forests, with tropical birds, with seashore, it was all a dream come true.
I remember the first sight of Jamaica. It was beautiful. Everything was emphasized, all the colors.
In the late 1930s, the sunny Caribbean was probably the last place that Jewish refugees desperate to escape Europe would have thought of. But in fact, colonies in the Caribbean, while never providing a mass refuge, were to provide a safe haven for several thousand. The stories of these Jewish doctors, diamond cutters and tailors were different on each island. In Trinidad, the majority of refugees came before the war. In Jamaica, it was only during the war that people were shipped by the Allies to a specially built camp. But for all of them, crossing the wind-swept Atlantic to arrive in the sweltering tropics was an encounter with a new and exotic world.
This is what the Jewish community looked at perhaps in the 40s. See this guy?
Yes.
That's me. And
Hans Stecher is the only remaining refugee still living in Trinidad today. He escaped with his family from Vienna shortly after Nazi Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss of 1938 and arrived in Trinidad later that year. When I met him in his beautiful cliff-top garden overlooking the Caribbean Sea, he told me how he and his family had come to the island.
in those days, it was very difficult to get into any other country. No country opened their doors to refugees, although it would have redounded to their definite benefit economically and intellectually if they had allowed Jewish refugees to enter freely. There were some people who somehow got to Shanghai. One would have gone to Timbuktu just to get out. And it so happened that my father had a brother who was, as a young adventurer, had deserted from the anti-Semitic Romanian army of the time, left Romania, and went to the New World. And it was he who wrote us that there was a small island off the coast of South America called Trinidad and Tobago, 2 islands. And they were British colonies. And he had learned that they were open to immigration against a security deposit per person of 50 British pounds. And that was a security deposit required, which he deposited for the whole family, except 2 very old great-aunts of mine, my grandmother's sisters, who were well in their 70s, and he did not include them. And no doubt they were caught by the Holocaust.
Can you give me your first impressions of arriving in Trinidad?
But you must understand that the reaction of a 15-year-old boy would be basically different from the reaction of mature people like my parents. To them, everything was strange and unfamiliar and somewhat frightening. To me as a boy, a tropical country was a dream come true. We all read Karl May avidly, the great adventure writer, and coming to the New World, to the Americas, was a great adventure to me. And coming to a tropical island, so beautiful, with people of all colors and religions, with Hindu temples and a mosque, with virgin forests, with tropical birds, with seashore, tropical flowers and blossoms that I had never seen before. It was all a dream come true.
By the time Hans Stecher's family arrived, there was already a community of several hundred Jewish refugees in Trinidad. They had come from Eastern Europe and from Nazi Germany. Most had known very little about the Caribbean before leaving Europe, and for many, the decision to sail to a Caribbean port was a last-minute one. Take this interview that appeared in the Trinidad Guardian on the 11th of December 1938 with Austrian journalist Ernst Fischer.
It is extraordinary how little is known of the West Indies in Central Europe. And when I left my native land for Trinidad, I did not know what I would find, and it is most peculiar that my staying in London, which lasted 3 months before coming on to Trinidad, I got less information there than I secured in Vienna, and that was very little. The more I see of this beautiful island, the more I'm enchanted. Before arrival here, I was very much afraid I would not be able to settle down in Trinidad. we feel that we have come to a home which will be to us a haven of rest and peace, not only for our travel-worn bodies, but also for our wounded souls.
The problem for people like Hans Stetcher and Ernst Fischer was that most countries were unwilling to accept Jewish refugees without money or sponsors. In April 1938, a British passport control officer in Vienna complained that since the Anschluss in March, great numbers of people in desperate situations were asking daily about emigration to the British Empire. The Colonial Office responded by asking all its consulates to strongly discourage Jewish emigration. At a time of British sensitivity concerning its refugee record, Sir Cosmo Parkinson, the Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, was aware that this response wouldn't look good if publicised, as he noted in this internal memo.
People will find it hard to believe that in all the wide expanse of the colonial empire, there is really no corner where some of these wretched victims of persecution could find shelter. However, this has been gone into before, and the conclusion reached is always the same.
But because many colonial dependencies didn't have visa requirements, the Colonial Office was at first unable to prevent Jewish charities from chartering refugee ships, which arrived almost daily in colonies like Trinidad. By early 1939, the Colonial Office reacted to the numbers coming in, changed legislation and started turning refugee ships away. In a particularly absurd instance, in February 1939, the steamship Caribia was refused entry by Trinidad, Barbados and then British Honduras. This was despite a large sum of money offered by a Jewish charity to establish an agricultural settlement in British Honduras, and despite the express support of the governor of that colony. The Colonial Office justified this decision by saying,
"It is a rather difficult decision to make. It is more than probable that hardly any of the refugees on board will be agriculturalists by profession, but they will certainly all say that they are prepared to engage in agriculture, simply in order to avoid the risk of being taken back to Germany. Moreover, if the governor admits even a few of them, it will be seized upon as a precedent by the Germans. At the present time, they are using peaceful persuasion to push out Jewish refugees on German, Italian and Japanese ships to any port where they can at present be admitted upon payment of £50 or so. My rather extensive knowledge of the Germans enables me to say at once that there is only one argument which will appeal to the German mentality, and that is to refuse to allow these refugees to land and to send them back to Germany. That may seem a cruel thing to do, but it may be a kindness to other refugees in the long run."
There were good reasons why Whitehall was so keen to protect its Caribbean colonies from further waves of immigrants, as historian Gordon Rollaire from the University of the West Indies explains.
That period was the period of very intense social unrest, a period in which Trinidad was undergoing a number of phenomena. For example, the relative failure, I would say, of sugar and cocoa, the depression of labor within the oil fields, which had emerged as the number one foreign exchange winner. Then there was the Great Depression of 1929, while Trinidad and the rest of the Caribbean felt the effects of that depression throughout the 30s. And if you look at the history of the Caribbean in the 30s, you would see that there were riots in almost every island. So that was a period then, I'm saying, 34 to 44, of great sensitivity.
In Trinidad, local inhabitants seemed to heave a sigh of relief that the Jewish community, having reached 600 or so, wouldn't grow much more after the new restrictions came into force.
Russia and France said we have to fight. Chamberlain said that it wouldn't be right, so he told them peace. He went to see Hitler to cool down his temper, to make him consider. It was in September, so he told them peace.
Trinidad's calypsos of the time are a good barometer of local feeling. There were many calypsos on Jewish themes, but none were recorded. As with many other controversial subjects, they fell under the colonial censor. In one case, the Colonial Office, rather ironically, justified this censorship, saying that the lyrics were contrary to the British policy of extending hospitality to Jews everywhere. I asked Gordon Rollair, who's a leading authority on calypsos, to talk me through one of these Jewish calypsos, Jews in the West Indies, written by Charlie Grant, who went by the name of Guerrilla.
Tell me what you think of a dictator trampling the Jews like Adolf Hitler, tumbling them out of Germany, some running for refuge in the West Indies, some land in Demerara and Grenada. They land in Trinidad, very regular. The way they are coming, all of them will make Trinidad a New Jerusalem. When a steamer comes to La Trinity, run down to the jetty, what you think you'll see? Male and female Jews in a band begging the authorities to let them land. Since Jews coming to this colony, they are marrying and raising a family. In a couple of years, believe it's true, Trinidad children will be only Jews. Imagine how a bunch of them congregate, sleeping in a garret by the 6 and 8. See them in the morning down at their store. You wouldn't believe they are sleeping on a garret floor. Anywhere you go, you can tell a Jew. The nose in their face, not like me or you. But the women all look rosy, like a Christmas apple in a grocery. Very, very soon, we are going to see Jews quite up to date in this colony, for they are industrious and will progress, for in all professions they are of the best. This is ambivalent. He describes their arrival. He then propagates this business of sleeping 6 in a garret and so on. This was one of the things which was always said about the West Indian immigrant, of them standing up and holding on to a rope. That's a joke, that's a stereotype, and he's repeating it here, you know. But the only contrast is he's saying that, but next morning you see them down at their store. So this is the sort of economic threat. It's veiled, but it's there.
But there were also more positive reactions to the new arrivals. Arthur Ince was editor of the Sunday Trinidad Guardian at the time.
I particularly remember Richter. Richter was a barber. You had Feldman, who opened a restaurant opposite to the Guardian. He sold local stuff and did a very good business. And he filled a need. That's the thing about it. You could go across there in those days and get lunch for 6 pence. You also had a chap named Schuster. He was an itinerant vendor selling cloth. And I remember Schuster coming to my home. And my mother, she had 9 children, of course, bear that in mind. So it was a difficult thing for her to manage possibly on whatever my father earned. So he was always welcome home because she could credit things on him and possibly pay 50 cents a week, 25 cents a week, what it is. So she was able to keep us all, well, I would say, well-clothed.
Do you think the Jewish refugees made an impact in Trinidad?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have no doubt whatever about it. In my opinion, all these people made good contributions. Wages in those days were very small. And they would walk about with packs on their back, very hard workers, with cloth and that sort of thing, selling to the poor people. You pay down 50 cents or 25 cents, and then you'd pay 15 cents or a shilling. In those days, you had a shilling. You'd pay a shilling a week. So they helped the poor people. They introduced a new type of credit, affordable credit. They filled a very major need in this country at a time when the black people in particular were very poor.
Suddenly, in the island's 2 main cities, Port of Spain and San Fernando, new cafes, factories and shops were opened, as an article in the Trinidad Guardian admiringly observed on the 19th of February 1939.
Even in Trinidad, there are a number of Jewish professional men and women, lawyers, doctors, a university teacher, journalists of good standing, and artists who have found a home here. One of the physicians, a lady doctor, is now a midwife, another turned chemist, and a third one is a foreman in a local factory. A famous master builder of Vienna is now looking for any kind of work. His wife makes a living by tailoring, a lawyer has become a canvasser, another a floor walker, while a third one is going to open a jeweler store on Frederick Street.
One of those skilled refugees was Herzog Feigenbaum, who came from Poland. His son Paul still lives in Trinidad.
I'm not quite sure what he did the first few months he was here. But after a short while, my father set up a handbag factory. because his family in Poland were into manufacturing. They made shoes, they made clothing, particularly uniforms for the Polish army, so it was something which he was familiar with. And when he came to Trinidad, he said one of the first ideas he had was really to set up a shoe factory. But in those days, being a British colony, they had to get permission from the British government. They had to see the colonial secretary and get permission to go into many forms of manufacturing. And my father told me when he went to see them, they told him that Britain was quite capable of providing the British Commonwealth with shoes. So that's when he decided to go into manufacturing ladies' handbags, which he'd done before in Poland, so he was familiar with it. And that's where he started, and he owned a factory called Faye's Leather and Plastic. And that's what he did for his entire life, make ladies' handbags.
Cultural and religious life also began to take root. A synagogue and community centre was founded in a rented house in Duke Street. There were aid societies for the poor and elderly, and even a dramatic and opera society that put on Yiddish, English and German plays. While the community was refused a licence to slaughter cattle according to Jewish law, they were granted a separate section of Port of Spain's main cemetery. And just as Jews from Eastern Europe and Germany were getting to know each other's different traditions, the whole community had to adjust to the Caribbean way of life.
Sometime in March, one morning, we hear from the streets the noise unbelievable.
Arthur Siegel was a refugee from Hamburg, and this was his first encounter with Carnival.
And my parents got scared. They opened up the windows, and we looked out. There were people walking down Richmond Street, a one-way street, and they were walking down in the right direction. And music blaring and noise, and they're singing, Matilda, 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 take the money and she run Venezuela.
Matilda, she taking money and gone Venezuela. Everybody, Matilda. Sing it out, boys.
And my father heard this Matilda, and he said, Adela, this is my mother's name, Adela Mariftach, Adela, they're calling you. Because to him it sounded like Adela. They'd never heard the word Matilda before. And my mother got excited. I mean, they don't know how my name, how can they call me? And I remember they, half jokingly, half serious, they had no clue what was going on. This was our first carnival in Port of Spain. And what we saw that day, people singing and dancing and laughter and drinking rum. At first, my parents thought, these are wild people. But by the end of the day, they really appreciated the wildness. And despite all the problems on their shoulders, you couldn't help but appreciate the rhythm of life that is part of the Trinidad Carnival.
One more time. Matilda. Sing it out, boys. Matilda. What it is at all? Matilda, she taking money and gone Venezuela.
That was to be the last carnival until after the war. As war broke out, immediately suspicion fell on the German and Austrian refugees who were to be classified as enemy aliens. At first, only a selected number were interned, but by the summer of 1940, half of Trinidad's Jewish community had been moved into camps. Internment was a policy that the Trinidad Guardian wholeheartedly supported, as this editorial in May 1940 makes clear.
Some of the Jewish enemy aliens who found refuge here from the horrors of Nazism have written suggesting that our campaign was based on anti-Semitism and appealing against internment on the ground that it is impossible to be a Jew and also Nazi. No fair-minded person will deny that there is merit in the statement that it is extremely unlikely for any Jew to be a Nazi. It must also be remembered, however, it is still very possible to be a Jew and remain a German.
The Jewish community defended itself in a statement published in a following edition under the headline, Jewish Association of Trinidad denies Nazi spy rumour.
To the public of Trinidad, Remarks have been publicly made that many of the Jews here in Trinidad are German spies. This is an absurd charge, for the Jews of the world have no greater enemy than present-day Germany. We ask the people of Trinidad that all remarks against us as German spies cease. Such matters are logically subject for the police, who know best how to handle them. To make attacks without proof against us Jews smacks too much of the German spirit, for that is the true German method. True British spirit is what we ask for and expect from everyone in Trinidad.
As Austrians, Hans Stecher and his family were some of the first to be arrested.
On my birthday, the police arrived in our little apartment, which was opposite the police headquarters, which also was suspicious to them. Why did we put ourselves opposite the police headquarters? Was it to observe the movement of the police or what? And interned us. In fact, they interned the family and a few others before they interned everybody else. We may have been, for some reason, particularly suspicious to them, particularly because of my roaming the hills with a map. I had a map, of course, which you could buy in any stationery store, but all that was suspicious to them, so they locked us up first. We said we have half an hour, my birthday, half an hour to pack. We packed, took us to a stinking police cell at police headquarters. There was a British officer. I had a dog. I said, can I take him? He said, yes, I'm a dog lover too. You can take him we're going to Nelson Island.
Today, Hans Stecher can see Nelson Island, where the men were kept, and the neighbouring Caledonia Island, where the women were interned, from his garden. It's just a 15-minute boat ride from Port of Spain. Professor Julian Kenny, who wants to turn the island into a museum, showed me round. The impression that I get here is of a big barrack-style room. Can you tell me a bit of what it was like before, when the refugees came?
When the refugees came, it was an open dormitory that ran all the way the length of the building. There were bunks and fibre mattresses, and there were some tiny windows.
While the refugees were here, what could they do on the island?
They would wash clothes, they'd play cards, they would exercise their mind, they would read and things like that. And then they would go fishing. They were the wardens allow them to swim down in the bay. If we just walk to the end, you can see, looking up there, you're looking up towards Port of Spain. And then if you just stick your head out a little bit, there you will see Caledonia Island, and you can see how close it is. Now, what happened with the Jews is that the men and boys were here. There was no contact except they could wave to their women folk, and the women folk could wave back to them. And then when it was very still and airless, you could shout and you could hear the noises.
Hans Stecher stayed on Nelson Island for about 3 months while a detention camp was built on the mainland. Here, he and his family were to be incarcerated for 3.5 years.
For the older people, for many, it was very hard to bear. It was very humiliating to be mistrusted by the British government and to be, as the first and most savage victim of Nazism, to be so mistrusted as to have to be incarcerated and deprived of the new won freedom. Of course, I shared all these feelings, but in looking at the positive side, I went to school. I was able to, during that time, to graduate from Queen's Royal College, which had been interrupted. I learned, by looking over the shoulder of another incarcerated watchmaker, more about watchmaking, and my father saw to it that I learned to make leather goods. And so that gave me my start in business when I was released. We also had small gardens. I was able to sell the garden produce like lettuce and other things to the camp kitchen.
What sort of food? Was it kosher that was cooked?
No, there was no kosher. Nobody had kosher, of course not. Whatever food they sent in, we had to cook. I cooked coffee in a kettle, huge kettle, maybe 1.5 yards in diameter, which you stirred with an oar. Can you imagine the size of it for all these people? There was a few hundred people. And there were boys and girls. We had dances, romances. We could study anything we wanted that we could lay our hands on, and I was always very keen on soaking up knowledge. So that was camp life. It was different depending on the disposition you had and the attitude you had to it.
The colonial administrators were following mainland Britain's policy of internment, but in the Caribbean, people were locked up for much longer. Adding to their anguish was the knowledge of what was happening in Europe. And for some people, life in detention was almost too much to bear.
Years behind barbed wire creates some psychosis among especially mature people who just can't take the close confinement, the hopelessness, not knowing what would happen, how the war would end. Would Hitler win? Would we all be caught again? What would they do when they came out? People get on each other's nerves. There were fist fights, there were fights, there were quarrels, but some couldn't take it. One became deranged. Dr. Carrel became psychotic and thought he was a reincarnation of Abraham, sat on the floor and eventually died. Another one, an old man already in his 70s, hanged himself. I found him and cut him down.
The last German and Austrian internees didn't leave the camp until 1944. Some had been lucky and had their businesses looked after by Polish Jews. But the intervening years weren't easy, even for those refugees who were free. Restrictions on movement enforced by the colonial authorities meant that many itinerant peddlers went out of business. People began to leave Trinidad for Canada and the United States. One of them was Harry Schachter, now living in Toronto.
We were Europeans. There was no university in Trinidad at the time. That changed. The University of the West Indies came to Trinidad many years after. We left in 1950, and I don't know when it came. And so Trinidad, even though it was a wonderful home and a wonderful refuge, it was always a temporary home. And my parents, even though they loved the place, and it was a small community, they missed the European things, they missed the European music, the larger Jewish community connections. So I don't think there was any question that we would eventually leave.
But many decided to make their lives in the peacetime Caribbean. In time, Hans Stetcher and his family built up a successful chain of duty-free shops, importing luxury goods and selling them to an increasingly prosperous post-war tourist industry.
I had an old application in with the United States for an affidavit, and that came through only in early 1950s. At that time, we had already established a small business, my father and I, making hats and handbags. So, on the very small beginnings, we didn't think we should uproot ourselves again, and I allowed my American immigration in the early 50s to be cancelled. And I stayed here, and don't regret it.
Meanwhile, over 1,000 miles away, another British West Indian colony was to play a significant role in the Jewish refugee story. Although Jamaica had a native Jewish community of about 2,000, there were very few Jewish refugees in the colony when war broke out. It would only become a haven for those fleeing Nazi persecution much later on in the war, and this would only come about because of the need to evacuate a population from another British colony closer to home.
Women and children leave Gibraltar. Owing to the international situation, women and children are being evacuated from Gibraltar. The first batches left yesterday and will be followed by more today and at subsequent dates. The War Cabinet in London has instructed the Governor of Gibraltar that the evacuation would be compulsory forthwith at his discretion.
In spring 1940, the British authorities decided they needed to clear Gibraltar of its civilian population. The Governor of Jamaica received instructions that summer to build a vast camp to house up to 7,000 evacuees at the site of a former sugar plantation just outside Kingston.
The construction of the camp was begun at once. 250 acres of land at Mona were acquired, and plans were carefully made for a large township.
This account of the construction of the camp is from the diaries kept by the Roman Catholic chaplain, Father William Feeney.
Roads were made and paved, trees and hedges were planted. Work was begun on 112 barracks, each to hold 60 persons. A chain-link fence 8 feet high enclosed the site. There were 2 dining rooms with a cement floor and a wooden roof, but no side walls. Each of these dining halls could accommodate 1,000 evacuees. A large number, running from 1 to 112, was painted on one end of the building. It served as street and number. Each contractor was given a fixed number of buildings to finish, and he was told it was a rush job, as the evacuees were already on the high seas. 3,500 men, using 6 million feet of lumber, put up the barracks and other buildings in 5 months.
But the anticipated number of Gibraltarians never arrived. The British only managed to send 1,500 to Jamaica, while the rest went to London and Madeira. With hardly time to pack, women, children and men over military age had to leave the Rock.
We went first from Gibraltar in 1940, and it took us 17 days to cross over to Jamaica.
Tony Conkey was a 14-year-old girl when she arrived with her family. She was one of 34 Jewish Gibraltarians who were evacuated to the camp.
I remember the first sight of Jamaica. It was beautiful. Everything was emphasized, all the colors. The flowers were redder than anywhere. The sky seemed to be on top of you. And both sides of the road were full of people, to see us coming. They had never had evacuees before. And all welcoming us. And when we got to the camp, each family was allocated the rooms they needed. And we had a communal dining room. But we had a separate part which was for the kosher.
Locally, there was great excitement about the camp. Connie Mark was a schoolgirl at the time.
At first, it was just a plain land. It was just land. And then we knew that, they're going to build a thing, and they were going to call it Gibraltar Camp. And then when they started building it, and so we would go over there now and again and pass by and say, look, Gibraltar Camp is going up. Look, Gibraltar Camp is going up. And we were interested that this camp was being built. It was something new. But the good thing about what I can remember about is that a lot of people got jobs there because they needed people to work there, because the people who were living there had to be fed.
The site is now the modern campus of the University of the West Indies at Mona. But there are many physical reminders of the old evacuee camp, including some of the long wooden huts used for stores and accommodation. You can still see the washing area with a row of stone wash basins and an old mangle, and the main campus road dividing the site is still called Gibraltar Hall Road. Because the majority of evacuees were Spanish-speaking Roman Catholics, the local priests and nuns were called on to help prepare for the new arrivals. I'm standing in the shade at the site where the nunnery was in Gibraltar Camp, and with me is Sister Bernadette, Sister Pascal and Isla Vickers. Sister Bernadette, what do you remember about this site?
We were seniors in high school, Isla and I, and we were about 14, 15 years of age, and we were told that this was a war effort, and would we come up to Mona area and help make beds to prepare for the advent of the refugees from Europe and Gibraltar. And we were happy to come. We lost no time in getting out of school too, and coming up and making beds. We made dozens and dozens and dozens of beds.
It was very necessary that when they came, exhausted and in a strange country, they didn't have to really set to work. So all they had to do was to put down their things and the beds were ready.
What do you remember, Sister Pascal?
Well, at that time I was a young sister, and my chief thing was with sports with the girls. And of course I was asked to bring our netball team to play these girls here. All I remember is that most of the time we won, and that affected these visitors. They got very glum, sometimes almost vociferous. And then of course the big trouble was they couldn't speak English, and that was a big difficulty. But little by little you heard them picking up little words here and there,
So they learnt English with a Jamaican accent. But local Jamaicans were also influenced by the newly arrived Spanish speakers. The poet Louise Bennett is famous for writing and performing in her native Jamaican dialect. Many of her poems focused on the effect of war in the colony, and she wrote several about Gibraltar Camp, including one of her most famous poems, Jamaica Patois. In this performance, recorded at the university, she gently mocks a young girl, Miss Liza, who's picked up Spanish phrases from people who work at the camp.
It's what Miss Liza, she the found of one like foreigner, because her sister husband get one job up a Mona. You want to hear her cut Spanish like she just come out from sea. So till them boys start call her the dryland refugee. This is how she greet me t'other day. Man, you on a chorus sing? How is your grandma? I hope she keep it muy bang. When she sell me, don't she say, add them up, senorita, for it's hard to intend this Jamaica dinero. Me didn't know how much you come to, but me start the idea up.
Despite these distractions, Jamaica was being inexorably drawn into the war. American bases were installed in many West Indian colonies. Fierce battles were fought off Caribbean coasts with high casualties from German U-boat attacks. Captured crews were taken to internment camps in Jamaica and other colonies.
Tramp, 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 we're on the road to glory. Tramp, 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 Jamaica marches on we go to Fair Island story. Tramp, 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 Jamaica marches on.
Plans to send more Gibraltarians to Jamaica were never realised, and Gibraltar Camp remained mainly empty. Costs to the British government were high, as this Colonial Office memo to the Treasury noted.
In the circumstances, it is little short of lamentable that we should only have been able so far to arrange for some 1,500 evacuees to occupy the camp. We can only hope that the vacant accommodation will sooner or later be turned to practical advantage.
That practical advantage became clear in December 1941, when the Allies felt it necessary to clear a surfeit of Jewish refugees who'd fled through neutral Spain and Portugal and were gathering in the port of Lisbon. The Portuguese capital had become the refugee centre of Europe, but from here, without money or visas, there was nowhere else to go. They were creating a bottleneck, and it was feared without their removal, Spain and Portugal would close their borders to further refugees, among them escaped prisoners of war and Allied personnel. The British government were approached again about using space in the colonial empire, and eventually they agreed to ship this group of Jewish refugees to Gibraltar Camp in Jamaica.
The first sight of Gibraltar Camp was quite a shock to us all. A big black man greeting us at the gate, wooden barracks in long rows. We were allocated 3 rooms, one for my parents, one for Baptiste, one for myself.
Miriam Stanton, her parents and grandmother were on the first ship, the Serpa Pinto, to arrive from Lisbon in January 1942 with 152 Polish Jewish refugees on board. In her recorded account of her wartime experiences, Escape from the Inferno of Europe, Miriam remembers her first trip into Kingston.
We walked very slowly from shop to shop, looked at their goods, admiring everything. It was absolute heaven. I had great fun in trying out my newly acquired English, which was still very poor. But with the aid of my dictionary, which I carried in my hand, I made myself understood. I talked to everybody who wanted to listen to me. I was amazed how many really wanted to talk to us. I didn't realize that we were the great attraction. Everybody wanted to know where we came from. They wanted to know all our history. But above all, what is news about the war? It was wonderful to see how much they all felt for us. They all knew that we were from the newly arrived group from Europe. It was a great feeling.
Over the next few years, small groups of Jewish refugees continued to be brought from Spain and Portugal to Gibraltar Camp. Alongside the Gibraltarians, there was a Jewish refugee population, which at its height numbered about 1,400. Inmates could only work inside the camp. There was a strict curfew imposed, and residents were allowed out only with special passes. The camp had its own shops, an entertainment hall, and places to worship. And in a mainly Christian environment, the Jewish evacuees and refugees were able to keep their Jewish identity. Tani Konki was awarded a scholarship to a prestigious convent school in Kingston.
There were 2 schools, Some girls went to the Church of England, and I went to the Catholic one, because one of the nuns said... Anyway, I didn't care because I didn't do any praying or anything. They had a lot of respect. Even once when we graduated, and I don't know if it was the bishop or somebody came, and all the girls, when they went up on the stage, they kissed his ring. And I was ever so embarrassed, a child, my dad wouldn't let me. Don't you dare kiss the ring. And I said, everybody's doing it. What are they going to think? They're going to be rude to me and all that. And they said, no, you don't do it. And he explained and they were ever so nice. So I shook his hand only. And he was quite respectful, that he knew that I didn't do that. So it was a lovely place, very, very nice.
Although the Polish Jews had converted one of the camp huts into a makeshift synagogue, Miriam Stanton was delighted to find a welcome from the established Jewish community in Kingston.
It was a beautiful synagogue. The solid mahogany ark, the pews, Mommy Baptiste and I, when holding hands together, looking around us, we were not following the service at all. We were just looking, not believing that such peace and serenity could exist in the war-torn life. Tears were running down my cheeks, and all I was praying for was, oh, please God, make an end to our past and let this be the beginning of a new future. But above all, peace. No more war. We had enough.
I was invited to Friday night service at the Duke Street Synagogue, where I met many members of the Jewish community who remember the refugees. Among them, Maya Matalon, from one of Jamaica's most prominent families.
We got to know some of the Jewish people because they needed assistance, and we wanted to give assistance, but we weren't allowed to commingle, so to speak, freely inside. Neither could they.
What did you think about the camp?
The camp was very sparse. I think they got a reasonable, quite adequate amount of food. But understand, it was not necessarily the kind of food that they had been accustomed to. And there were serious shortages in this country of food. So I'm certain, and listening to Miriam, whilst they were not, shall I say, grumblers, there was problems on the food. We were a rice-eating country. They came from a potato-eating economy. We grew yams and sweet potatoes, something they knew nothing about. But they couldn't get their potatoes because at that time, Jamaica didn't raise what we call out here Irish potatoes. I might have found this strange if I had gone to a camp in Poland and was given potatoes.
What sort of sense do you think the refugees had when they arrived in Jamaica? Do you think they felt that it was a refuge for them?
Yes, it was an escape away from what looked like at the time, in the early part of the war, the distinct possibility that the whole of Europe was to be overrun, including Britain. So escaping to this side of the world, so to speak. Now, I think this happens at the first arrival. Thank God we're away from it. When the inactivity and the sitting in a restricted institution, hidebound by rules, your freedoms are impaired, you would be less than human if you didn't get dissatisfied. And there was dissatisfaction over it. In other words, the marvelous attitude of being saved soon dies in the face of boredom.
This boredom contributed to much unhappiness and disappointment among the refugees. The British government had stipulated from the outset that they would not be allowed to work and would have to leave Jamaica as soon as the war was over. Their dependence on an American Jewish charity which paid for their upkeep added to their frustration at the conditions they were now living in, as this letter to a newspaper from a Polish refugee shows.
If the Joint took it upon them to rescue us, they ought to complete their rescue work and not leave us halfway to our sad fate. What we desire is to be rehabilitated, just as so many others have been. And as this is impossible in this country, under the hospitality conditions accepted by you for us, we must insist that we should be sent to another country where we will be allowed to be free, law-abiding, useful citizens, earning our living, and where we will not be obliged to live in barracks and spend our life in idleness.
By 1942, knowledge of Gibraltar camp was widespread, particularly amongst those charities who were maintaining refugees at the camp and some who were using it as a positive story in fundraising campaigns. Questions were asked about why it wasn't full. In late 1942, the Colonial Office discussed a request from Sir Herbert Emerson, the High Commissioner for Refugees.
Emerson has inquired whether we can let him know the position, particularly in regard to Jamaica, where a statement has been made to him that there is room in existing barracks for about 4,000 persons. In view of the unfavourable insinuations about Jamaica, which certain Jewish ex-internees have been spreading on reaching the United States, it may seem odd that the Jewish organizations should appear to want more accommodation in the colony. But if we can truthfully tell Sir Herbert Emerson that the island's accommodation is entirely used up, so much the better.
So this is a map of Gibraltar Camp Mona, Camps 1 and 2, dated December the 12th, 1940. So the evacuees had already been there several months. And this is a memo dated 2 years later, dated the 30th of June 1942, and it gives the assignments of huts and cottages. There's 8 vacant cottages and 3 or 4 vacant huts here, and this is in 42. I was looking through papers left by Father Feeney, the camp's chaplain. They clearly show how much space was still available and unused. By December 1942, Allied governments knew about the Nazi policy to exterminate European Jewry, and as the news filtered out, protests were held in Britain and America, demanding that the Allies make rescue a priority. In that month, the BBC's German service broadcast this chilling statement, telling its listeners that thousands of innocent men, women and children were being murdered just because they were Jewish.
Sie schildert die grauenhafte Brutalität, mit der die Hitlerregierung Hunderttausender völlig unschuldiger Männer, Frauen und Kinder kalten Blutes hinmordet, nur weil sie Juden sind.
To what extent rescue was a possibility is a contested area for historians. But Gibraltar Camp could have offered a home to those Jewish refugees able to get to the corners and edges of unoccupied Europe. But for the procrastination and reluctance of the British colonial authorities, more lives could have been saved. Whenever it was expedient, the British did use its empire to house people. Anyone deemed to be a threat to British security was sent to internment camps throughout the British Empire, including the Caribbean. One internee was Jewish refugee Dr. Rudolf Aub. He'd escaped from Germany to Sierra Leone, which was then a British colony. From there, he was transferred to an internment camp in Jamaica. I met his son, Martin, who's now a professor at the University of the West Indies.
My father arrived in Jamaica in December of 1940 and was interned at what is now known as Upper Camp in Kingston, along with all kinds of other people, some Jewish, German or ex-German persons who had lived in Jamaica for some time but who were nevertheless also interned as enemy aliens. And of course, various people who had been captured on ships. But my father was again kept somewhat separate and in fact helped with the camp administration to a certain extent and looked after some of the medical needs in the camp. Among others, I gather that he looked after the first Prime Minister of Jamaica, who was also interned at the time as being a danger to security at the beginning of the war.
After his release in 1943, Dr. Alb decided to make his home in Jamaica. He set up in general practice and sent for his family, who'd spent the war in hiding.
After a very, very stormy voyage, we arrived here on the 12th of November 1947, which was exactly 9 years to the day when my father was arrested in 1938. My father was at the quayside, and we found our great delight that my father had acquired a car. The first time the family had ever had a car. After our luggage was cleared, we were taken to the boarding house where my father had been living. We then had a birthday celebration for all the birthdays that we had missed during all this time.
What were your first impressions when you arrived in Jamaica of the country?
Well, it appeared to be a tropical paradise. We'd been literally starving. The idea of being able to eat was fantastic. And having left Germany weighing something like 90 pounds, within a very short time after arriving in Jamaica, I weighed 125. I remember, being thrilled by seeing my first coconut tree. And of course, I went to school. I was a bit apprehensive about that because having come from a time when I was being despised for being Jewish, I would now be despised for being German. And to my great surprise, nothing like this happened at all. Everybody was very interested in this strange fellow with relatively little English to start off with. So I was very quickly, completely accepted and completely assimilated. So it was really a case of not coming home, obviously, but a case of settling in.
The Alb family were among just a handful of Jewish refugees who stayed on in Jamaica. Most of Gibraltar Camp's inhabitants left in 1944, the Jewish refugees to new destinations. The evacuees went back home to Gibraltar. While life in the camp was often difficult, Tony Conkey looks back without regret.
I was very glad we went there. I would never have had an opportunity to go to Jamaica. And it was beautiful. And I made friends, and the education was very good. 4 years of high school, I wouldn't have had that chance in Gibraltar.
Trinidad and Jamaica are just two of the former colonies which offered sanctuary to people fleeing Europe. All across the Caribbean, the story of wartime Jewish refuge is repeated, each island with its own different experience, and each with its own living reminders of a Jewish past. In Trinidad, the refugee community gradually drifted away, and today Hans Stetcher is the custodian of their memory on the island.
I'm not an Orthodox Jew, I'm very more Reform-minded. But wife and I, we keep the minimum of the traditions. We have a Pesach, we have a Seder, so we've had a Seder under a tent for most of the people, but I don't do it regularly. Last one is just the two of us.
So after the war, it was possible to continue feeling Jewish, and did you also start to feel Trinidadian?
I'm Trinidadian by adoption, yes. I've lived most of my life here. I identify with the country. One can be more than one thing. I'm a Jewish Austrian. I also love Austria. I love Israel. And I love Trinidad. These things are not mutually exclusive.
Those sons and daughters of the doctors, diamond cutters and tailors who stayed have mostly assimilated into a Caribbean identity. But a visible Jewish legacy remains, woven into the fabric of contemporary Trinidad. Avenues and streets are named after the scientist Albert Einstein, the Zionist leader Theodor Herzl, and Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann. In downtown Port of Spain, there are stores too that still bear the names of their Jewish founders, like the Yufe family, whose name is etched into the pavement in front of one of their many fabric stores. But Hans Stetcher walked me round perhaps the most poignant reminder of Trinidad's Jewish past.
It was very neglected.
Yeah.
Oh, this is the Jewish section of the Mukurapo Cemetery. There would be about 56 to 60 graves here of the people who stayed and who were buried here, all refugees. Here, for instance, my father, Dr. Victor Stetcher. He died in 1953. And you can walk around and see the names and the Hebrew writings. I was in camp with many of these people. Others were Poles or Romanians and remained outside. Pulver, Romania, Falkenstein, Walter Hahn from Germany. This is my mother, Sophie Stetcher, and the other daughter, Wilhelmine Boltenester. She was like a second mother to me. My aunt, a writer, well-published and successful in Vienna. And we all had to do different things. She started a shop here with making hats and so on. Never wrote again. It's like a plant transplanted from its accustomed soil. Cannot bud again. Never wrote again.
A Caribbean Jerusalem was presented by Joanna Newman, the Director of Education at the London Jewish Cultural Centre. The producer was Sue Ellis. Additional material was provided by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.